This is a University of Otago podcast.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this lecture on behalf of the Catholic Diocese of Dunedin. In a moment, Anne Gilroy will welcome our speaker, Steve Bevans, to join us. Just a very warm welcome to you who are here to join us for the lecture, everyone joining us through live streaming, and a real thank you to the University of Otago for making available the Burns lecture for us today. So, thank you.
Thanks.
And I'm delighted to introduce tonight Stephen Bevans. And Stephen is the Emeritus Professor of Mission and Culture at the Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. Now, it doesn't sound like anything, but Stephen has a worldwide reputation in missiology, one of the forefront theologians of our time. And we're really, really fortunate to have snaffled him from Melbourne, where he's teaching, for this weekend in Dunedin. Now, some of you I know are friends of Stephen, are meeting him around the world at conferences and meetings on theology and mission. And others will know Stephen through his many books and papers. But tonight, all of us will have the pleasure of hearing, seeing, and participating with Stephen at work, laying out his ideas, discussing them, inviting us, as it were, to chew on them. And so, Stephen, we welcome you among us.
Thank you, Anne.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you so much. Well, thank you, everyone, and thank you all for coming, and welcome especially to Bishop Campbell. It's a real honor that you are here. Oh, there you are. and welcome to all those who are watching this in its streaming form, or perhaps even its video form in the future. My topic, as you see on the screen, is a God of mercy, a people of mercy, and the subtitle, The Year of Mercy and the Mission of the Church. And what I'd like to do is to begin my reflections this evening with a poem, with a very famous poem. It's a poem by William Shakespeare. And when you hear that, you may guess it comes from toward the end of his play, The Merchant of Venice, Portia's very famous speech about the quality of mercy. So I'm going to put that on the screen, and I have it at first with, I'm not sure who Portia is, but I think that's Sir John Gielgud. They're playing Shylock, I believe, in The Merchant of Venice. And I'm going to read the poem and then kind of go back to that once in a while in my presentation this evening. The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. It is twice blessed. It blesses him that gives and him that takes. 'Tis mightiest in the mighty. It becomes the throned monarch better than his crown. His scepter shows the force of temporal power, the attribute to awe and majesty, wherein doth sit the dread and fear of kings. But mercy is above this sceptered sway. It is enthroned in the heart of kings. It is an attribute to God himself. And earthly power doth then show likest God's, when mercy seasons justice. Therefore, consider this, that in the course of justice none of us should see salvation. we do pray for mercy. And that same prayer should teach us all to render the deeds of mercy. This famous speech of Portia's, which no doubt has been quoted a lot in this year of mercy that we're celebrating in our church, really startled me when I first read it, when I reread it after many, many years, because I actually found here kind of the outline for what I want to share with you about mission and mercy, or mercy and mission. So on the one hand, as Shakespeare says, mercy is an attribute of God as such. And then people are most like God when they season justice with mercy, when they render the deeds of mercy. And so my reflections with you this evening are going to be in two parts. First of all, I'm going to reflect on our Trinitarian God, a God who is a communion in mission, as a God of mercy. And then secondly, I'm going to reflect on how we as a church are called to be people of mercy, because we have all been baptized into the very life of God as such. And so to play on Pope Francis's definition of the church in his wonderful document Evangelii Gaudium, we are called to be a community of missionary, mercy-bearing disciples. So let's first look at the idea of God as a God of mercy, God as a communion in mission, who is a God of mercy. Shakespeare says in Portia's speech that mercy is an attribute to God himself, as he puts it. Cardinal Walter Cosper, however, who wrote a very important book on mercy, and one that actually has inspired Pope Francis very much, Cosper says that mercy as an attribute of God needs to be understood even more fundamentally. He says it is God's defining attribute. He says it can't be regarded as simply a marginal or derivative quality of God, but instead he says mercy is the essence of God, who is love. Mercy, I think, is at the very heart of God, and the English word mercy doesn't really capture the meaning of the word, but the Latin or the Spanish or the Italian and even the German captures the idea of mercy much better. Misericordia, the word core. It's about the very heart of God. In German, Barmherzigkeit. Herz is the word for heart in German. And the idea is that mercy is what is flowing out of God in God's deepest self. That it's the outflowing of God as such. Shakespeare says that the quality of mercy is not strained. It's like, oh, okay, I'll have mercy. No, it's out there. I gave this talk last week in Brisbane, in Australia, and a woman said in the audience, she says, I'm a cook, and I think of, you strain stuff, and you put stuff through a strainer, and only a little bit comes out. She says, no. She says, I think of it as mercy is not strained. It's just everything there. It's another way of thinking about it, that it's not just the essence, but it's everything. It flows out of the very heart of God. And this is why, as Pope Francis says over and over again, God never tires of forgiving us. It's because that God is merciful from God's overflowing heart. And the other thing is, I think that mercy is more than about God just forgiving. I think there are other aspects that it's important to look at when we speak of God as a God of mercy. The first is that because mercy flows from the very heart of God, it shows that God delights in creating and delights in God's creatures. It also means, I think, that the merciful God is one who wants and works to relieve pain and suffering in the world. And then, of course, it means that God is always forgiving, that God never tires of forgiving. I believe that mercy is the deepest motive for God's mission. So let's look at mercy from the beginning and then look at mercy in the Old Testament. This first part of my presentation is kind of in broad strokes, of course, is kind of a biblical meditation on mercy and God as a God of mercy. You know, every week in Rome, on Sunday at noon, crowds gather in St. Peter's Square. The Pope comes out on the balcony, and the Pope delivers, he first of all says the Angelus with the people, and then he delivers a little fervorino. Well, about a week or so after he was elected, Pope Francis, in his Angelus message, told the story of an old woman that he met when he was Archbishop of Buenos Aires. And the woman said to him as they were talking, you know, without mercy, the world would not exist. And Pope Francis says, you know, it's kind of like without missing a beat, as he is so good at, he says, oh, do you teach theology at the Gregorian University in Rome? You know, I think, you know, the point is that creation itself is God's first act of mercy. And it's also the first act of mission. I don't think, you know, mission is about a kind of a plan B. You know, human beings sinned, and so God has to send a redeemer, and, you know, we have to, all that. I mean, you know, certainly that's all true. But in the wider picture, I think the thing is that God begins mission with creation. And I like to see mission as our participation with God in the continuing of and the bringing of creation to perfection. So I think that creation is really an expression of God's overflowing heart of mercy. What St. Bonaventure called God is diffusive of God's self. God's love is diffusive of itself. The Australian theologian Dennis Edwards describes the act of creation as the gentle and caring and loving and freeing action of the Holy Spirit, who coaxes and persuades creation after the beginning, after the Big Bang, in the formation of the gases and the formation of the molecules and eventually the stars and then the planets, and then goes on as life emerges in Earth, as microbes begin to form, and perhaps ferns begin to come out, and kiwis begin to emerge, and tuis and human beings. You know, that's the work of God, the freeing work of God in creation, the overflowing love of God that's manifest in creation. The American theologian Elizabeth Johnson writes how the Spirit's presence is active all through the creation process. There was never a moment when the Spirit was not present in the process of creation. But she says it's not the presence of a determining monarch, but rather the freeing, life-giving presence of a lover. So creation is conceived and executed in mercy. Right after I came to Australia in February, I've been in Australia, as Anne said, for several months, I attended a mission conference of the Anglican Church in Australia, and the keynote speaker there was Bishop Stephen Picard, who is an Anglican bishop, works in Canberra. And Picard, in the course of his talk, talked about how the universe is sustained by a continual and infinitely patient act of love. I think that's the same idea that I think Dennis Edwards talks about and Elizabeth Johnson talks about as well. Shakespeare says that mercy is mightiest in the mighty. And I think we see that, in God's loving, freeing presence, the Spirit's loving, freeing presence in the work of creation. Pope Francis in Evangelii Gaudium quotes Thomas Aquinas, and I never ran across this in Aquinas myself, but I was startled when Aquinas says that mercy manifests God's omnipotence to the greatest degree. Because to have mercy, one has to have that patience. One has to have that love. One has to have that care as things go on and take their own course. It's in the history of a relatively insignificant people, though, that God revealed God's self fully as a God of mercy. As we know, in Abraham, all nations would find a blessing. And in and through Israel, God would show mercy. I was writing this talk after I got to Australia, and I got to Australia right at the beginning of Lent. And as I was writing this talk, I think it was the third Sunday of Lent, if I'm not mistaken. And the first reading in the lectionary was about, as depicted here in this painting of Marc Chagall of Moses and the burning bush. It was the story of Moses and the burning bush. And I was thinking a lot about mercy. And I read in the text, it said, God appears to Moses in the burning bush. And God says, I have seen the suffering of my people. I have heard their cries, and I'm going to do something about it. I think that's another way, of expressing God's mercy, or explaining God's mercy. And as God gives the law to Moses on Mount Sinai, as the Jews would say, God's great proof, the law is God's great proof of God's mercy and love. God puts Moses in the cleft of a rock and passes by Moses and cries out, I think in many ways, the great line about the God of mercy in the Bible. The Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for the 1,000th generation. A God of mercy who frees the people of Israel and who gives people of Israel this great law to live by. Now, I can't go through every possible passage of mercy in the Bible. The Bible is full of indications how God is a God of mercy. But I want to focus in on one chapter of the prophet Hosea, chapter 11. I was reading an Anglican pastor and theologian, his name escapes me, Sam. It's going to be here in a second. But he was a chaplain at Duke University in the United States, but he is now the vicar of St. Martin in the Fields on Trafalgar Square in London. And he says that this passage, Sam Wells, that's his name, Samuel Wells, and he says that this passage of Hosea, he thinks says everything. It says everything about God's mercy. And he talks about it in terms of 4 parts. I'm just going to focus on 3 parts here. And he says the first part is a part where God is reminiscing. So the chapter opens up, and God is reminiscing about God's love for Israel. When Israel was a child, I loved him.
May I interrupt for a moment?
Yes.
And see, there's something not right about the mic, and maybe we can get it to sound a bit better. Sorry to interrupt.
Sure.
Microphones. Tried to call the guy, but I can't. Microphone, what? Come down. I don't know if that's going to be better or not,
Okay.
but you're distorted.
No problem.
Start again where we
Okay.
were.
When Israel was a child, I loved him. It was I who taught Ephraim how to walk, God says. I was to them like those who lift infants to their cheeks. And Sam Wells says, you can feel God stroking Israel's soft skin. You know, what a tender scene, he says. But then, in the chapter, the mood changes. It's almost like if this was a beautiful, major key of music playing in the background, it goes, ta-da, it goes into a kind of a minor key. And God begins to lament Israel's unfaithfulness. And God says, the more I called them, the more they went from me. My people are bent on turning away from me. And then we have the third scene of this chapter, and it's a scene God doesn't quite know what to do. God doesn't quite know where to go. And as Sam Wells says, this is the most poignant scene of all, and we're given a window here into the very heart of God. He says it's almost like an all-night struggle between sober, realistic pragmatism. Okay, let them go, or passionate, wild fury. I'm going to wipe them out. But ultimately, it's about overwhelming and tender compassion or mercy. And God says, how can I give you up, Ephraim? How can I hand you over, Israel? My heart recoils within me. My compassion, my mercy grows warm and tender. So God cannot save Israel from the consequences of Israel's unfaithfulness. But God will always work. God will always work for Israel's salvation. Yes, there was the exile. Yes, there was suffering, but eventually God promises that new covenant, and God promises the fact that God's mercy ultimately, God's love ultimately is going to win. Pope Francis, in the document that starts out the Year of Mercy, Misericordiae Vultus, has a wonderful quote from St. Augustine, which reads like this: it's easier for God to hold back anger than to hold back mercy. I think that's the whole. The whole point of this chapter 11 of Hosea. Then there's one small verse in Psalm 49, which really strikes me. Psalm 49 is not one of my favorite psalms, especially the ending about vengeance and this kind of thing. But there's a verse in the beginning that is really lovely, and I think as again Sam Wells says, it might explain how God's love, how God's mercy is crazy, illogical, a matter of pure grace. And it's the verse, God delights in God's people. There's simply something about this people that has moved God's heart. And as we know, as the Old Testament goes on, we see that this applies to all peoples. One of my favorite all-time novels is a novel by Marilyn Robinson called Gilead. It's a novel about a Protestant minister in a small town in the U.S. farming state of Iowa. And the main character who's writing reflections for his son as he's about to die, as the minister is about to die, a man by the name of John Ames. In one of his reflections, he writes this. He says, you know, he's a Congregationalist minister, but his best friend is a Presbyterian minister, so he reads a lot of Calvin. And he reflects at one time. He says, you know, somewhere in Calvin, there's this idea, he says, that each person is an actor on a stage, and God is the audience, and God is watching, you know, with interest what people are doing. And then Ames muses, he says, I do like Calvin's image. It suggests how God might actually enjoy us. I believe we think of that far too little. And then he goes on to say, not in any simple sense, of course, but as you enjoy the being of a child, even though he's a thorn in your heart. I think that's you know, the delight that God has in God's people. Can a mother forget the infant at her breast? Of course, Isaiah writes famously, walk away from the baby she bore, but even if mothers forget, I'd never forget you. Never. So mercy, broad strokes in the Old Testament. Now let's look at incarnate mercy in the New Testament. In the fullness of time, Paul writes, the mercy, I think, lavished upon all creation, but on Israel especially, takes on a human face in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. I don't know if I've read this before or whatever, but as I was reflecting on this, I'd say, Jesus is incarnate mercy. You know, it's a beautiful phrase. I don't know if I made it up or if somebody else did or whatever, but Jesus is incarnate mercy. Or as Pope Francis says, Jesus is the vultus misericordiae. Jesus is the face of mercy. Anglican theologian by the name of Mark Oakley writes about how Jesus is God's body language. I love that phrase. You know, Jesus is God's body language. And I think we see God's mercy in Jesus' exorcisms and healing. So, for instance, in the healing of blind Bartimaeus in Mark's Gospel, Bartimaeus cries out as Jesus passes by, as we know, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And Jesus did. And Bartimaeus received his sight. Or we see, I think, mercy incarnate in Jesus' healing of a leper. Again, in Mark's version, Jesus hears the leper's plea. If you will, you can make me clean. And the text says he was moved to pity, and the Greek word there is this, you know, he was moved in his bowels, you know, he was so touched by this man's plight. And so he reaches out and he touches the leper. I was meditating on this sometime in the last year, and I thought, you know, Jesus was not like, ew, you know, a touch like that, you know, it's maybe the way I would do it, you know, but it was rather, you know, not a hesitant or fearful touch, but a loving and generous and merciful touch, an embrace, and the leper was healed. And then every once in a while in the Gospels, I think we see mercy incarnate in Jesus' attitudes and actions. So one time I was reading Mark 6, and Mark 6 starts when the disciples have been sent out and they come back and they're all excited. Oh, we did this, we did that, we did that. And they were telling Jesus about it. Jesus is in the midst of a crowd, healing and everything. And Jesus says to them, let's go apart. Let's go apart and rest a while. I always think, he's kind of like the pastoral supervisor. Let's go out and process this, and kind of reflect together about this. And so, the text says they were so busy and there were so many people there who wanted healing that they didn't even have time to eat. So Jesus was in the midst of this crowd and they were all trying to grab him and everything. So he said, let's go away. So they kind of sneak away and they go around to the other side of the lake of Gennesareth. But the people see what Jesus is up to. So they get boats and they go across the lake and they beat him there. So that when Jesus and the disciples come, there they all are again, And if it were me, I would have said, oh no. I thought we could get away. I thought we would take a day off, process this, pray together, this kind of thing. No, but Jesus doesn't do that. Jesus just simply, the text says, he simply began to heal. And eventually, because they had no food, Jesus feeds the whole crowd. It just seems to me that's just one of these little examples of incarnate mercy. No hesitation at all. The quality of mercy is not strained. It's just there. So, incarnate mercy, the face of mercy, clearly God's body language. And many of Jesus' parables also are incarnations in words of God's mercy. And especially this is true in Luke 15. I read somewhere a number of years ago that if by any chance we would lose all the Gospels, they would all disappear, and we only had Luke 15, we would have the whole thing. We would have the whole gospel there. So, the parable of the shepherd going for the lost sheep, the woman tearing her house apart to find the lost coin, or especially the parable of the loving father and the prodigal son and the jerky brother. So I think all these parables are parables in words, are incarnations in words of God's mercy. And in these parables, I think what we see are the determination of God in the shepherd and in the woman. And we see God's patience in the parable of the loving father. And we see God's joy when that determination and that patience pays off. Again, Pope Francis, God never tires of forgiving us. I think there's a marvelous parallel in a poem that I ran across about a year ago by the American poet Wendell Berry. And it's a poem called To My Mother. So I think it's a nice parallel to the loving parable of the loving father. But I think it captures the same idea. I was your rebellious son. Do you remember? I wonder if you do remember. So complete has your forgiveness been. So complete has your forgiveness been, I sometimes wonder if it did not precede my wrong, and I erred, safe found within your love. Prepared ahead of me, who perhaps foresaw the worst that I might do, and forgave me before I could act, causing me to smile now, looking back, to see how paltry was my worst compared to your forgiveness of it already given. Of course, God's mercy perhaps is most fully and graphically revealed in Jesus' death on a cross. As Paul says, I think so powerfully in the epistle to the Romans, it's hard enough for someone to die for a good person. But this is the love of God, that while we were enemies, while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Another poem that I think captures this beautifully is again another American poet by the name of Denise Levertov. And she has this long poem, and I won't read the whole poem, just a section of it, but a long poem called To Live in the Mercy of God. And it goes like this: to live in the mercy of God, to feel vibrate the enraptured waterfall, flinging itself unabating down and down to clenched fists of rock. Swiftness of plunge, hour after year after century. Thus, not mild, not temperate, God's love for the world. Vast flood of mercy flung on resistance. Really, really powerful. I think it expresses, what Jesus' death on the cross is about. Of course, we know that Jesus' death was not the end of the story. That, as the New Testament scholar N.T. Wright says, if Jesus had not risen from the dead, our faith, we would not be here today. That Jesus would just be another one of those great figures in history that had wonderful ideas, and those ideas passed on. But I think what's really significant, and this is a segue to my second part, what's really significant here is that the resurrection then endows us with the life that is the life of Jesus, and clothes us, as it were, with God's mercy. So that mercy of God incarnate in Jesus has now been shared with Jesus' disciples, those who are called to be his church. And so we come to the second part of my presentation, and that is a people of mercy, a community of missionary, mercy-bearing disciples. The great mercy of God, which we've seen just sketched out in creation and Old Testament and New Testament, doesn't stop with God simply having mercy on us. With God having mercy on us by giving us the gift of existence and life, or working for our healing and liberation, or restoring us to relationship after sin. God's mercy in our baptism takes us into God's very life and takes us into God's very mission. It's amazing to me lately. I've been reflecting a lot on Paul, and Paul reflecting on Christian life and Christian life after baptism, and how Paul links the life of Christ, the reality of Christ, with the life of Christians. So in baptism, we put on Christ, as he says in Galatians, or we have the mind of Christ, or we're conformed to Christ, or we become the body of Christ, the continuation of Jesus' presence in the world. And there are so many more. It's what the early theologians of the church began to talk about as theosis, or deification, that we take on God's very nature. What does that mean? What I think that means is that as what God was doing in the world, in God's mission of mercy from the first moment of creation, so now in baptism, we are called to continue to do that same thing, to act as partners with God in the continuing of creation, in the continuing of God's merciful work in our world. So that's what I'd like to suggest. Because God is a God of mercy, we ourselves are people of mercy. So God is that intemperate waterfall that Denise Levertov talks about. God's mercy is that mercy that's not strained, or as Pope Francis says in his document at the beginning of the Year of Mercy, God is that river of mercy that flows out into the world. And we who are baptized then share the divine life, and because of that, we're called to be witnesses to be sacraments of God's mercy. to ourselves be God's body language in the world, to embody God's mercy in the world. Now, how might we embody mercy today? I think we need to be, first of all, a church of mercy. And I think, first of all, that means that we need to realize that we ourselves need mercy. Both as individuals in the church, yes, but as an institution. I've given this talk in Australia, where they're going through the humiliation and all the difficulties of the investigation of the Royal Commission. I think the church has to say we need mercy. That we first of all are people who need mercy from the highest level to the lowest level. At every aspect of ourselves, we need mercy. And I think that really could already be a moment of evangelization. The vulnerability, the humility of that we are open to God's mercy, can right away show, that we believe that our God is a God of mercy. But then, as Pope Francis says, we also have to embody that in our church. As he puts it in Vultus Misericordiae, at the beginning of the Year of Mercy, the church has to be like an oasis of mercy. Or as he puts it in Evangelii Gaudium, the church has to be like a mother with an open heart, or the house of the Father with its doors always open. The house of the father of the prodigal son. When he commissioned the confessors who would go out as missionaries of mercy at the beginning of the Year of Mercy, he says, you can't use a club of judgment. Sorry, I thought that was there, but you can't use a club of judgment to bring people back in the church. You have to use the medicine of mercy, quoting Pope John the 23rd. And this open door policy that I think Francis is calling us to refers so much to the sacraments. He says in Evangelii Gaudium, the doors of the sacraments should not be closed simply for any reason. He thinks of baptism, first of all, the great door to faith. I think it's really important that about 2 years ago, Francis baptized the baby of a couple that had not been married in the church. Baptized them right in St. Peter's Basilica to show that, we have to be open to people who, if they want their children baptized, we should be open to that. The doors of the church should be opened to that. He speaks famously in Evangelii Gaudium of the fact that the Eucharist should not be a reward for the perfect, but medicine for the weak. And I think in his last apostolic exhortation, Amoris Laetitia, he opens the door, perhaps ever so slightly, but yet opens the door to the question of admitting, in certain cases, of course, those who are divorced and remarried also to receive communion as well. He says in so many places, the church is not a toll house. The confessional shouldn't be a torture chamber. Oh, here it is. You shouldn't use the club of judgment, but rather, offer the medicine of mercy. In his interview that he gave to Jesuit magazines all around the world, the Pope says that the ministers of the church must be ministers of mercy above all. Pope Francis's motto is one that comes from a homily by the Venerable Bede, so the 6th century monk in England, in Latin, miserando atque eligendo. It means, kind of literally translating it, having mercy, he chose him. It's a homily on the calling of Matthew in Matthew's Gospel. So having mercy, Jesus chose Matthew. But as the Pope prefers, as he says in his interview, I really like it. He says, I like it, as he put it in Spanish, misericordiando. He chose him. Mercying, he chose him. He makes mercy into a verb. And I think we need to make mercy into a verb as well by doing acts of mercy, by doing works of mercy. We speak in our tradition of the corporal and spiritual works of mercy. And of course we know what they are. The corporal works of mercy have roots in the Old Testament, particularly in Isaiah and in Micah. The Christian form draws from the judgment scene in Matthew 25. You know, I was hungry and you gave me to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me to drink. A stranger and you welcomed me. And this is what the corporal works of mercy are: feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, welcoming the stranger, clothing the naked, healing the sick, visiting those who are in prison. And then the Christian tradition adds to Matthew 25, the list in Matthew 25, bury the dead. But I think we can add another one today, and that is a corporal work of mercy is the care for creation. We'll come back to that a little bit later. The spiritual works of mercy are things like instruct the ignorant, counsel the doubtful, comfort the sorrowful, admonish the sinner, gladly forgive injuries, bear wrongs patiently, and pray for the living and the dead. And we have to remember that hand in hand with acts of mercy, we have to realize that we need to be committed to justice. If justice is to be tempered with mercy, as Shakespeare says, I think mercy needs to be tempered with justice as well. Mercying doesn't just relieve suffering and misery, it goes to the root of problems. It works for personal and societal and structural change. And mercy is not simply, it's not simply justice for victims, but also justice for perpetrators. So we need to season this mercy, however, with justice. We need to season justice with mercy. It's like the prophets, you know, they were after justice, and they could be adamant about this and angry, and yet they did it not because they hated the people that they castigated, but because they so deeply loved them. So let's look a little bit at mercying in today's world, and if I may presume, a little bit mercy in today's New Zealand. I think there are many concrete ways, but I want to focus here on three. And that is to talk about having mercy in an age of migrants and refugees and asylum seekers on these poorest of the poor, having mercy on the variety of the world's victims, and finally, having mercy on creation. So let's look at each one of these very shortly as I come into my final section here. First of all, mercy for migrants and refugees. I think it's significant that Pope Francis's first trip outside the Vatican was to the island of Lampedusa, in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, which was the first landfall of people migrating from the northern coast of Africa. And in his homily, which is a really incredibly moving homily, he says, you know, that many victims have been dying at sea, dying in boats which were vehicles of hope, and now have become vehicles of death. And he goes on to say, has any of us wept because of this situation and others like it? Has any one of us grieved for the death of these brothers and sisters, for these young mothers carrying their babies? We are a society that has forgotten how to weep, to experience compassion, mercy, suffering with others. And he says that the globalization of indifference has taken from us the ability to weep. And we see the same kind of indifference in many Europeans with Syrian migrants as they're knocking on the door to try to come into Europe, or with demagogues like Donald Trump, who would exclude, Muslims from the United States, almost round them up in concentration camps, it sounds like, and put a wall across our southern border to keep Mexican migrants out. In their pastoral statement on social justice, the Australian bishops have focused on the question of migrants and refugees, which of course in Australia is a particularly burning issue. And Bishop Long Nguyen, who's a Vietnamese bishop who is the auxiliary bishop of Melbourne, is the chair of the committee, and he writes in the introduction to this statement, "We Australians have rightly felt appalled at the danger that refugees experience on their journeys, but we seem to have come to believe that harshness and rejection will be enough to deter desperate people from their flight to safety." So as individual Christians, I think, and as church, as institution as well, we need to do all we can, I think, to be people of mercy to who are, I think, the poorest of the poor today. I think, this idea of the corporal work of mercy, of welcoming the stranger, takes on a particular concreteness when we're faced with the refugee crisis today. Or the spiritual work of mercy, as Pope Francis pointed out in his homily at Lampedusa, of praying for the living and praying for the dead. I think this should take shape in our voting, in where we put our money, and in the way we pray. My sense is that New Zealand is being fairly hospitable to refugees, but we probably could do more. And our church and as Christians, as people of mercy, we could probably do more as well. Secondly, I think as people of mercy, we're called today to be merciful, to show mercy for victims and perpetrators. Again, that spiritual work of mercy, of consoling the sorrowful, takes on a kind of concreteness there. As we open up our hearts to the world's victims, whether they are women sexually harassed and raped, or victims displaced by war, or human trafficking. I heard a talk about a year ago or so that says there are 29 million slaves in the world today, the result of human trafficking. Child soldiers, particularly in West Africa, but also in South Sudan and so forth, victims of sexual abuse. And of course, we could go on and on and on. But I think we have to be people who recognize the evil that is being done and stand in solidarity with the world's victims. And so things like visiting the sick, corporal work of mercy, in connection with victims of AIDS and Ebola and the Zika virus, or giving food to the hungry and drink to the thirsty as we care for victims of natural disasters in our own country, perhaps, or abroad. Of course, it's much harder to offer mercy to perpetrators, but we can practice the corporal work of mercy of visiting prisoners, and the spiritual works of mercy of forgiving injuries and bearing wrongs. Now, I don't mean that we should ever forget the evil that they did or absolve them from the consequences of their action, because society does need to be protected from criminals and rapists and sexual abusers and so forth. Yes, mercy needs to be tempered by justice. And yet, should the punishment that we give them be something that is inhumane and something that is vengeful? Should we work as much as possible with trying to develop restorative justice, where victim and perpetrator can come together and recognize the evil that has been done and try to make, some kind of new relationships. I think these are things that we as people of mercy can do even in the face of perpetrators. Finally, I think we have to talk about mercy for creation. In Evangelii Gaudium, Francis speaks of creation as one of the poor of the world, as a weak and defenseless being. In Laudato Si, he has this powerful statement, the earth is becoming a huge pile of filth. He calls for, as Pope John Paul II called for back, I think in 1990 or 1991, of an ecological conversion. The Philippine bishops, Francis quotes them in Evangelii Gaudium, wrote that God intended this land for us, God's special creatures, but not so that we might destroy it and turn it into a wasteland. The New Zealand bishops, I think back in 2004, in their letter, very short and nice letter on the environment, begin the letter by saying, what does thou shalt not kill mean when 20% of the world uses the resources of the 80%? What does thou shalt not kill mean when 30,000 people die each day of poverty? It's time to become stewards of the earth when half the world's species are scheduled for extinction in the next 20 years. And they go on in this short but eloquent declaration to talk about this issue. I think we have to join them, join Pope Francis in being people of mercy by having mercy as well on creation. Just a few words of conclusion. And I want to quote part of Pope Francis's letter at the beginning of the Year of Mercy, when he says, in this year of mercy, in this Jubilee year, let's allow God to surprise us. God never tires of throwing open the doors of God's heart and wants to share God's love with us. The church is called, above all, to be a credible witness to mercy, professing it and living it as the core of revelation of Jesus Christ. You see that double dynamic that I'm talking about there, the God of mercy and the fact that we as church need to be the people of mercy. So I think, as I finish, that we just acknowledge the fact that we are called to work with God, the God of mercy, to become a people of mercy, to become ourselves a community of missionary, mercy-bearing disciples. So, thank you very much. Thank you.